Welcome to the Mycelium Signal podcast. I'm your host, Konstantin Tuonihovi. Today we are privileged to interview the maestro of occult black metal, Kyle Spanswick, better known as Naas Alcameth. He hails from the United States and is a renowned multi-instrumentalist and vocalist, known for his work with Akhlys, Aoratos, Bestia Arcana, and of course Nightbringer. So, Kyle, welcome to Finland. We are embracing summer here as the sun is setting. How are things at your own end?
First of all, thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here. Things are going well here. As the sun's going down on you, it's right in the middle of the afternoon here for me. So
I don't know even how many thousands of kilometers of geographical distance we have between us at the moment, but we have some 7 to 8 hours, or was it even 9 hour time difference?
I believe we're 9 hours apart.
Yeah, that's quite a lot.
It is.
Anyway, are you involved in any new projects that you can tell us about?
Currently, I am engrossed and have been for some time now working on the next Akhlys album. So that is taking up a majority of my time between that and all these tours and live shows we have coming up. That's pretty much keeping my plate very full.
I can imagine. It's very exhilarating to hear that the new Akhlys album is in the works because I have been a huge fan of the Melino album. I feel it's worth mentioning how we came across you here at the Tuonen Portti Collective, which roughly translates to the Netherworld Gate. Over the past 2.5 years, our journey has been akin plunging down chthonic rabbit hole. Our collective was founded in late 2020, and it was around that time I stumbled upon Akhlys. The captivating artwork by Dennis Forkas Kostromitin, who also designed the cover for Behemoth's Satanist album, immediately caught my eye. My Daimon, it seems, prompted me to give Melino a try, and at first I was overwhelmed by the wall of sound. However, after numerous listens, this labyrinth of an album began to take shape before me like an esoteric puzzle. An interview of yours I read in Bardo Methodology magazine piqued my interest when you spoke about metaphysical panic. You also recommended that readers explore the works of Canadian author Brigad Gavin, which I did. And lo and behold, I interviewed him just yesterday for this very podcast.
Oh, great! Yeah, no, that's excellent. That's an fortuitous way to come across my work, I would say, because obviously it shows that you already have an invested interest in those things. So that's maybe a bit more unique than perhaps how others in the scene discover Akhlys, which is probably just for a love of black metal in general first, and whether or not they have a love for the lyrics and the subject matter, that may or may not be.
I have been listening to black metal for some 30 years now. I'm 45 currently. It's quite interesting how different people or persons meet within this field of the occult, for example. And I definitely think this is more to do with the esoteric than just black metal.
Yeah, I would agree. We're near the same age. I'll be turning 43 actually this summer, so I've been listening to black metal music for roughly the same amount of time. I've always felt that there is an attraction to black metal for me that was based on maybe stuff like mysticism in a more general sense. This kind of unknown aspect that appealed to me more than maybe some of the other aesthetics that you found in black metal at the time and still do, like maybe stuff like misery or warfare or misanthropy or those kind of things, which I do still find those intriguing, of course. But what really drew me in was that element of mysticism that I found in certain bands, and so naturally moving into playing black metal myself, that's where I was invested, and so that's the direction that naturally I wanted to take it.
I have the similar story myself. I think it was in 1994 when I first discovered Burzum, I think, and that's a name you shouldn't mention in for example Facebook. Either you get a goddamn 30 days ban, but that's another topic we are not going to discuss because there are so many more interesting topics at hand. But yeah, this was the same with me. I thought that in the black metal scene I would meet people who have similar interest in the occult, and I was right about that. But then again, there were lots of people who were just in it for the music. Of course, I don't have any problem with that, but my main interest has always been within the occult and the esoteric, and here we are. And it's quite interesting synchronicity that this day, May 27th, 2023, marks exactly 2 years since the inauguration of the Netherworld Gate Collective, our collective, that is. It's very intriguing to have you at this day for this interview.
Very cool. Yeah, I mean, I always try and pay attention to these synchronicities.
They tend to quite pile upon each other, if you catch my drift. And sometimes you get like whole streaks of synchronicities in a row, which kind of defies the rational mind.
Yeah, and I think when you do get those synchronicities, of course, you don't want to be overzealous about that and kind of interpret everything to having some sort of greater meaning. There is, of course, always room for coincidence, but it's good to pay attention to certain things, and as you had stated, when they start to line up one after another, then that is kind of when perhaps you should start paying attention.
Yes, I of course know I don't know if it's like a mental problem, but how they define it nowadays. But it's like I think there's this thing called magical thinking, and with schizophrenics and people like that, they might have like a problem with it because everything is just interconnected and magical. I can easily see how that could become a problem. And I think you yourself said that you're like kind of a skeptical occultist in the sense that you always weight these kind of synchronicities and whatnot with like not a skeptical lens, of course, but you kind of examine them, what kind of weight they have, and not just to take them at face value.
Yeah, certainly. I like to weigh those things, and even when it does pique my attention, I even still then don't run wild with it. There is actually a psychological phenomenon that occurs. For example, you'll have a lot of people say that they have found. I think they phrase this as in kind of a new age phrasing as angelic numbers. I've seen it phrased as that. This is where someone notices that the clock says it's 4:44, and they notice that 7 times during 1 week, and now all of a sudden it has great significance. Well, there is a known psychological process that once it's happened twice, you make a mental note of that, whereas other things might be occurring during the same week that have similar synchronicities that maybe you didn't make a mental note of, and so you're not as aware of them, you're not looking for them, but once you start subconsciously looking for them, then they will appear. And so you have to keep these kind of things in mind, so these known psychological occurrences, and not get lost to everything. So in this instance, it could very well be that your mind has just latched on to looking for that, and so if you look for it, any individual might see the time 4:44 several times a week, but they never made a mental note of it, but you have. And so now you don't want to get lost in that and say that now this has got some great significance, and now we're going to go into some kind of gematria and interpret this as a sign from a higher force. So
Yes.
the skeptical occultist in me is when these things happen, depending on the starkness and the uncanniness, weigh that out. Otherwise you can get lost quickly into this kind of new age passive mysticism that really is just, it isn't going to do much service.
Yes, it's like a low effort kind of thing. And I think another way to praise skeptical occultist might be like a pragmatic occultist, in the sense that you kind of approach occultism as like a not a tool, but you're I just mean the pragmatic side of things, that it must have some kind of like a working counterpart in the tactile life.
Yeah, exactly. Otherwise, you're gonna again just get kind of lost to these things, and even when you do start feeling something might be even subtly uncanny, then you have to interpret what that means exactly, and what use it has. Even when, say, things that are quite phenomenal or paranormal, or however you want to phrase that, even when they occur, you still have to examine these things and what is the use at that point, and you have to determine what benefit you get from the realization. um, and Gwinon had warned about this, and of course this is in a from the view of a more transcendental path, but that for these individuals that are kind of blazing that path, that these things that would fall into these categories of those kind of uncanny things that might manifest in the worldly, the supernatural, the paranormal, when they do manifest, he kind of took the stance of, take it with a grain of salt. Don't let that stop your progress where you get distracted by that, where you're just in constant awe by these things that could very well be just byproducts of the initiatory path. And so you have to keep that in mind too, because then again, if you are absolutely bound by fascination to anything supernatural that occurs while heading down an initiatory path, then you're going to be quite distracted at all times. And you should note these things and weigh them and their significance, but without being, just absolutely sidelined by them or distracted or finding a terminus within these things.
Yeah, I think it's quite a fine line, like between being a total like pig-headed, like I mean, like in the worst sense of the word, skepticist, and then there is this in the another end of the spectrum might be some kind of new age type of, you know, person who is into that kind of stuff.
Sure. And then one always has to ask themselves why they're doing certain things. If it starts to feel like you're doing certain things ritualistically or in an initiatic context, simply to as a catalyst for the supernatural to occur in and of itself. I mean, outside of, I guess, reaffirming your own belief in that, again, what is the value? That also could be a very volatile thing. And so you don't want this to be your end game. It also can fall into very egotistical things, and own ego self-adornment. You could put a lot of focus into attempting to rouse subtle forces, so that they manifest in such a stark way, in the waking world, I guess you could say. But then again, like, what is the purpose of that exactly? So you should always keep those things in mind. Like, I think it was Crowley had said something like, perhaps it's possible to walk on water by magical means, but why not use a boat?
Yeah.
And so I always love that one. I've used it before, but this is the kind of thinking that one should have. And also, you shouldn't enter these things like with a frivolous mindset, because attempting to open any kind of dialogue or pathway with things that you don't fully understand, things that are beyond the worldly rational. Again, there's a volatility to that, and an immensity that maybe perhaps people don't fully appreciate or understand before they attempt those kind of things.
Yeah, there are definitely risks involved. And one risk, I think, is that when you are delving into this kind of liminal things and the liminal world, you are quite a bit on your own if you don't happen to have some kind of network of like-minded people around you. I mean, like these kind of things are frowned upon and not understood at the so-called consensual reality, the reality which is defined by, for example, social media, news, and whatnot, the everyday life, everyday understanding of the world at
Sure.
large.
I mean, well, to have some kind of uncanny bleeding into your world is one thing, that can occur accidentally, or that can occur intentionally. Now, to push that further, if you want to again enter into some kind of dialogue with whatever that otherness is, or you want to enter into a more immersive experiential back and forth with that otherness, you have to keep in mind that it is not on your ground. You're pushing into the liminal, which means that you are quickly entering their ground, and so it's going to turn the rational on its head, and you are leaving the world of the discursive behind. And so, as you said, you suddenly will be very much alone, in that regard, with this very incomprehensible and immense thing, whatever it is before you. So again, these are the cautionary tales. They might sound over dramatic. I think that you can see these certain things reflected in even certain very artistic writers, who weren't necessarily invested in the esoteric, but that had focused the majority of their life and their will upon the liminal. Like you could look at someone like Poe. And then you find this in these artists who have put this complete focus on this, and their mind has been riding this cusp of the liminal in the imaginary, which I would say a more proper term would be the imaginal. It probably cusps onto that, the divine concept of the imaginal, like you find with the Sufis, or like espoused by like Corban or Swedenborg, or those individuals. And the consequence sometimes at the end is real. You'll see with authors such as Poe. I mean, he kind of died in misery and madness. And so, you spend so much time dealing with this unmooring from the discursive and the grounding of the worldly rational. And you really have to be prepared for that, because it can really break down some of those pillars and anchors that you want to keep one foot within, or lest you be completely dissolved by it.
Yeah, we can only remember what happened to Austin Osman Spare, for example. It's like he was a veritable genius, of course, but it didn't end well with him. And there are numerous other examples if one just digs them out. But I think we just apparently went right into the rabbit hole, but that's okay, because that was my intention anyway. But maybe before we talk about the antidote to egoism and many kind of maladies in the occult world, I think the antidote really is what Richard Gavin has coined sacred horror, but we'll get into that a bit later on. I think it would be interesting to talk about your music first, because it really ties in with the many interesting subjects we are always discussing with Rihmastosignaali, Mycelium signal. That's Rihmastosignaali in English. So basically, over the years, you have been incredibly prolific, creating music that spans from ritual ambient to death and occult black metal. I have had the pleasure of immersing myself in much of your discography as an artist, and in my opinion, Akhlys represents the pinnacle of modern esoteric black metal. And if you're willing, I'd love to delve deep into some highlights from your albums and songs and learn more about them. Let's begin with Aoratos, which has released album Gods Without Name. That's one of my favorites from your discography.
Oh, thank you. Regarding Aoratos, that one was kind of a special album for me, I suppose.
Yeah.
The impetus for that kind of was maybe a bit more profane. With the Akhlys was kind of in a state of limbo at that time. We were having some dealings with a previous label, and just certain things going on that we weren't certain how to move forward, or even if I was going to move forward. So while that was in limbo, I decided I didn't want to stop the creative outlet. So I had created Aoratos, and it gave me a chance to do something that was a bit more specifically nuanced. I had wanted to do something that was directly pointing at the concept of the Genius Loci and drawing upon a lot of personal experiences, especially stuff from my childhood. Time spent out in certain parts of nature, time spent on my aunt and uncle's farm, and certain old relics and locations around those places. And then this esoteric philosophy that I've cultivated since then into my adulthood. And so I wanted to do something that captured that rural. And actually Richard Gavin had phrased this pretty well. The pastoral dread was very important there as well. So I wanted to kind of gather all these ideas and these images and these themes that fall generally under what we could term the Genius Loci. So we're talking about spirits of the place. So these locations and areas that seem to give off a resonance of foreboding, and typically these locations are what's synonymous with them is they aren't places that are typically inhabited. They don't have much human traffic, or people don't typically dwell within them. So they become these kind of hinterlands, these outlands. Historically, symbolically, you can even look to the Bible and find these represented by stuff like the ocean. The desert is another great one that's, again, very has much religious connotation. A lot of the casting out of individuals, they'd be cast out of society into a desert or into a wilderness. So those are the most obvious, but also we can find places that used to be inhabited and are no longer. Dilapidated ruins. These could be ancient ruins, of course, but more in an everyday sense. And in my experience, it was stuff like the old ruins of a farm that had been long abandoned, or a cabin or a house or some such place. So you can move anywhere from, a place in unchecked nature that maybe never was really cultivated by society to begin with, or you could find these places that once were, and now they are these ghost town relics or what have you.
That's absolutely fascinating. I have lots of experiences with the Genius Loci, and that is, I kind of learned term like some years ago, but the phenomenon I have known all my life, and it has become more and more important for my own work. To get more specific, could you tell one story, for example, about some experience with this kind of like a very specific Genius Loci, for example, of the dread spirit of the place variety? You have this song at Gods Without Name album, because
Sure.
that's fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of them that immediately come to mind are, again, from my childhood. I had mentioned my aunt and uncle's farm. So
Yeah.
this in an area, a very rural area that's out in the farmlands of Colorado, in a very, very small place called Wiggins, Colorado. Very small population. So it's a farming community. So you're going to have lots of wide open space, right? And then a lot of these farms have the plots, at least, have been there or owned by the same families for many generations. And so it's not uncommon to find that they'll have a more modern house and farm, but next to it will be the ruins of a previous one that has been abandoned. And I used to go as a child. Me and my brother would go typically about every summer for a while there for many years. We go stay a week or two up there on the farm, which is something we really look forward to, because of course now you get to do stuff like shoot guns and ride motorbikes and kind of live that farm life a little bit, go out on the tractor. But there was, the old farm silo and the old dilapidated barn and just all these old relics just strewn about, rusted out old cars and sheds, and then even the field itself, it can be is a very powerful symbol of the liminal place. So when nightfall would come, that whole area would just change, and it could be whether I was looking out the window of my cousin's bedroom across the field to the somewhat ajar barnyard door to the dilapidated barn. You can start to engage the imagination. So I think that's the first step, but it has this resonance, right? And I think that anyone can relate to this kind of resonance, and you want to, at least I do. I think not everyone would be of the same mind. I would be compelled. I wanted to enter that space. You want to kind of zone in on that resonance and like a radio antenna, and increase it and experience it and bring it to its full capacity. Now, whether or not you intentionally do that, or you happen to stumble into an area where it just gives you that sudden feeling of dreadfulness, that uncanny otherness, where you feel like you no longer are on common ground. Those are the hallmarks of that spirit of the place, and you can find it even a bit more subtly in more simple settings. You can the symbol of the house is something that I've been obsessed over. That's going to be a big part of the next album. But even within a house, in a typically structured house, a lot of people will innately have a subconscious dread of the places that are less inhabited within the house, often the cellar, the attic, the basement, those kind of places. Again, very important symbols, especially in dream and whatnot. But even within someone's own abode of dwelling, there can be a liminal space nearby.
I can really relate to that, because at our cottage there was this part of the plot which has a small crop, and it had this old house from the beginning of last century. So it was basically around 80 to almost 100 years old, I believe, at the point where I was making some explorations to there when I was younger. And it was an interesting place in the sense that there was this the living space, and there was this attic. It was like straight out of some horror story or something. It was really intriguing, and it was full of old stuff. And I believe nobody actually had spent too much time over there. And the whole place was practically like falling apart. And in the living quarters, there was this big hole in the ground. The floor had collapsed, and there was like a crater, and it looked quite sinister at times. And at one point, my father thought that it was a risk, because that thing could collapse on itself, and it was demolished. And afterwards, I found good use for that liminal space. But near the old cottage, there was this old ground cellar. It was quite small space, and it was completely in ruins, and it had like some meter and half long pile of debris above that. And at one point I had this idea that I'm going to excavate the goddamn old ground cellar where I used to hang out when I was a child. It was quite interesting place. Then after some months after the excavation, I converted the place into kind of a chthonic chapel, and it really changed the whole place. And I would say now that it has a very definite, very tonic spirit of the place. And I have had many interesting and intriguing meditation sessions over there, and I can really relate what you said.
Oh yeah, and that's amazing, because obviously you had the previous experience from childhood, and
Yeah.
those symbols that resonated with you. So that's going to be like a ritual artifact that's going to be planted into your subconscious anyhow. So you're kind of excavating that as well when you
Yes.
at a later age, and made that into your sacred space. So there's going to be that connection to the past there already. And it's almost in these places that once were inhabited, you could also speak to like the concepts like the ancestral dead, and they can almost be a sanctuary yet tomb, at the same point. So no, that's very cool that you had that at your means, and that you had cultivated that space afterwards.
Yes, I think it can be a very exhilarating and initiatory process to embark on this kind of catabasis, also to your mind and also into the elements, into the ground. And for example, that place has been owned by my family for at least maybe now 100 years. And so it has lots of history.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And then of course, like you had mentioned that, so the ground part, the part beneath, against the archetypes there are very charged and very pregnant. So the archetype of the cellar, in the concepts I'm working on now for the next Akhlys is very much based on the house, as represented in dreams, which is, I think just about anyone that has had dreams has had dreams of either being in their house, an old house, a house of some sort, but
Yes.
there's a canniness about it. And I'm structuring this into a more traditional cosmos hierarchy of the middle would be the hearth, which that would be typically in the waking world, that would be the place where you would inhabit, and then the hearth would be where not only the daily living goes on, but also the rites. And so the hearth was important to the rites of the ancients, and it's certainly central in the figure of the house with the ancients. And then of course beneath that, so you can equate that to something like maybe just on the liminal cusp, in a Kabbalistic sense, of like something like Malkuth, if we wanted to speak Kabbalistically, just for reference here. And then the cellar or basement would be the underworld, and how I'm structuring this. And in my experience in dreams, I am often in a house, and either it has a connotation of an old house or a house that I once inhabited, and sometimes not at all. Usually it's very barren. Often there's so the fireplace we can equate with a hearth, or there is literally a hearth, and often it's ashen and no fire present and empty. But then there is there is again that spirit, even the spirit of the place of dreams, that you feel the resonance with, and then you feel that it's calling to you from another location. And often that most dreadful location will typically be a basement or a basement-like area. At least that's how I've personally experienced it. So that I'm equating with the underworld, and perhaps where you have the most direct dialogue with that spirit of otherness in this instance. But then again, interestingly enough, we could also look at the attic, which is above. And so something I've ruminated on in this context. So another sort of hinterland in the structure of the dream house is the attic, which we again feel resonate in the waking world as well, in houses that are structured this way. And so the attic can also resonate with that same feeling of presence, where the presence is residing. And I'm still hammering out all of this, but not to give too much away. But with the attic, I'm kind of looking at this as the higher communion, whereas the lower communion would be the moment of ecstasis and dread with the dialogue and the encounter with the absolute other. And where the attic, where it would be more like a union. So above in the attic is how I'm poetically stating this. But yeah, anyhow, kind of digress there. But within these structures, we can find these things. And so it goes to show you that whether it's often a foreign desert or a far off forest, I mean, you can find these same things very close to home.
That's absolutely amazing. I have had these dreams for the last couple of years at least. They are recurring dreams, and there's this element of a shadow cottage or shadow house And it really resonates what you just said, in the sense that, for example, just to give an example, in that kind of dreams, it seems like the actual cottage visit, which isn't that big, is actually like a mansion or something, and the majority of the house is actually underground. It's like inverted house, and there are like kind of corridors and rooms beneath the main floor, which haven't been inhabited in, for example, hundreds of years. And they are like you, what you said in methodology interview. I don't remember if it's Akhlys or Aoratos interview, but you said that they induced this metaphysical panic. It was so intriguing to hear about that, this concept of the house. I don't think I have heard anybody else talk about this subject in this sense before.
Yeah, and I don't know to what extent it exists outside of my own. I mean, of course, there is certainly a sacred symbolism to the house that I'm building upon here, but in this very specific dream context, married to dread, I'd be interested to see if that does exist out there somewhere for sure. But it was interesting what you said in your dream with the inverted house and the corridors. So another important aspect that I'm including, because I also have had similar experiences, especially in dreams, where, and I had one recently that was very much tied to all this. I was trying to reach, it was more or less a basement type area. Again, that's where the presiding spirit was centralized, apparently, which was in this, this dark basement-like area. But to get to it, I had to just keep traveling through hallway after hallway after hallway, and that was also part of the, I guess, the crux and the challenge was navigating through this. And this, again, I find is kind of a pillar symbolically in these sort of dreams. And so I'm including this in the next album with the symbol of the labyrinth or the maze. And that these, the house, especially in a dream, can become very uncanny, because whether it's first perceived as mansion-like or small, it's very protean. So it's a protean maze, and you turn down, one corridor and another appears. And I think there's a lot of divine symbolism that we can find in that as well. So it's part of the trial of navigating that maze.
Yes, I'm definitely looking forward to the next album, and these themes. They really struck a chord in me, and I really think I know what you are looking for with that. But let's continue with the Genius Loci, the kind of a primordial sense, because you have a fascinating concept with the album. There's this track, Dread Spirit of the Place, and this one seems to clearly be related to Genius Loci, of course. And I find it intriguing how you depict the primordial shadow side of this ancient phenomena, that is the dread spirit of the place. And the track gives the impression that the Genius Loci itself is speaking, and here is an excerpt from the lyrics when I think it's speaking. Aspen trees, neath leaden skies, behold this deed with 1,000 eyes, white as bone and still as death, until branches stir with the devil's breath. The line about 1,000 eyes sent shivers down my spine. At a certain point in the track, the spirit appears to turn volatile, as if in a sudden fit of rage. And I think this effect was especially potent when I listened it in a liminal setting, such as a forest at night.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's and that volatility, I think often you will encounter with the Genius Loci. I don't think that they're, at least in my experience, and maybe this is my own spiritual disposition being projected, but they're not necessarily friendly or approachable. So again, that's almost has to be earned. It's almost an initiatory process in itself. When they are emanating dread, part of that is consequence of something being otherness in itself. That's going to be our primordial reaction. Another part, though, I believe is very much also intentional, a testing, I guess you could say. And you're either going to flee from that, but if you don't flee from it, it can lead to the ecstasis that I have previously spoken about. That again ties to what the Greeks were speaking about, the ecstatic dread, which leads to the state of abjection. And so
Yes.
that point of abjection is where the ecstasis actually occurs, because it's like if you were a shifter on a car being between, first and second gear, somewhere in between, you're shifted outside of yourself suddenly. And it's not usually a very subtle thing. It's a very kind of violent casting off, where this dread has flung you into this state of abjection where you no longer have a complete sense of self, and you can even lose the connotation of objectivity and subjectivity, I and other. And I think losing that is actually a hallmark of you're doing it right. You are actually communing a consummation with said thing. Now, in this specific song, I was, again, there's always a poetic element.
Yes.
I'm talking about two things at once here. As I was imagining this, we have a lot of aspen trees where I live here in Colorado. I've always seen aspen trees. Trees are interesting to me to begin with. I think the different genuses of trees are very specific and have their own specific attributes. Aspen trees, especially during the fall and winter, tend to come across as very ominous. They are bone white, they are very gnarled, and that the reference to 1,000 eyes is at once speaking about the all-seeingness of the Genius Loci, who is kind of inhabiting all areas at once within that liminal space. And at the same time, totemically being reflected through the aspen trees, which if you look at an aspen tree, it looks like they are covered in eyes. And so again, kind of a poetic play on the verse there, being surrounded. I was picturing being surrounded by these aspen trees in a dreadful spirit of the place, and now the eyes of the aspen are also the eyes of the entity of otherness.
Interesting. It's so rare to talk about these kind of things with the person who really knows them too very well. The verse with 1,000 eyes, that was really interesting, because it brought to my mind this old idea of mine that these Genius Loci forces, or whatever they are, if you think them as entities, seem to be kind of like amorphous. They are not like a person or individual, but more like one would think some kind of octopus, if you catch my drift.
Yeah.
Like amorphous.
Yeah, they're very protean. Well, I mean, in being incorporeal to begin with, it loses that necessity, and those kind of needs for that to just it is there. I mean, it's literally the spirit of the place, so it is the place itself. So
yes,
within that abode, at least it is without those sort of limitations. So you could phrase it up as it has 1,000,000 eyes and 1,000 tongues and whatnot.
Yeah, and I think if one thinks about in some kind of dualistic way about this thing, I think it's wrong, and it's like a wrong approach to this kind of thing. And I wouldn't associate the dread spirit of the place, the dread aspect, to anything satanic or whatever moralistic. It's not that. It's just like you said. It's the holy other, like Rudolf Otto said.
Absolutely, yeah. It has. I really don't think that any kind of moral codex comes into play with at all. You've left all that behind once you've left the discursive world of rationality, and that is not how that's not where these things exist. So again, you're on their ground, and that dreadfulness is not the same knee-jerk reaction that one would get with sin, let's say, or breaking a moral codex. It's not the same thing of a fear of tarnishing your own valor or morality, or threat of some kind of religious damnation or anything like that. It exists way beyond that, way above that, before those ideas would even come into play. So it is absolutely alien, absolutely other, exactly like Otto. So that would be perfectly aligned with Otto. And his concept of the religious experience, I mean, in its true stark naked form, that's what it would be. And so that height of ecstasis would come with not only awe, but a fear that is beyond a fear of being physically harmed or being a social outcast. It is much more deep rooted than that. It's much more soul displacing, and that's again that puts you into that state of abjection where you start to lose your foothold on your own concept of your own ego and who you are. That ground slips away just by being in the radiance of this thing.
Definitely.
And yeah, and this is again because this thing would be fully other. So this would just be its natural accord.
I think the Numinos defies all kind of categorization, and that's why it's so terrifying. It cannot be put into neat packages like people used to do in modern age.
Yeah, well, I think that unfortunately, in the modern iterations of any religion, usually are the flame has gone out in the temple. Unfortunately, they've gotten lost in the exoteric. Well, the esoteric has been lost. And so what you're left with in some of these examples, like you could say modern iterations of Christianity and whatnot, that it's now based on really just a worldly morality.
Yeah.
And so it's hard for maybe these individuals that don't connect with these certain things to understand, because they've made a worldly morality their highest accord. And not to say that morality is a negative thing by any means, but it is a worldly thing that can position you, or I don't know, perhaps position you and how am I trying to say this? For things that might be numinous, but that would, again, it would be before. So, but without the concept of the numinous, the truly numinous, a modern Christian that doesn't understand the roots of these things who thinks that this is all, would probably understand a term love differently than someone who is esoterically aligned and understands the traditions. Again, that would be like a concept like eros, which these terms love, compassion, fear, death, rebirth, they've become very marginalized because they're only understood through the most rational and worldly lens in the way that we experience them day to day, profanely.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I need to go back a bit for the volatility aspect of the liminal and of course the Genius Loci. Have you ever? I'm of course speaking of personal experience. Let me say it first and not put any words in your mouth. So basically, I have at least a couple of times witnessed or experienced this kind of very weird phenomenon. For example, I might be in some kind of liminal setting, perhaps in a ritual or something, of course, in a rural area. And at some point, it almost feels like the temperature is dropping by like 20 degrees or something. And it really gets like the atmosphere can turn very hostile. And it's kind of, I think that's exactly the abject part. And if in some instances, I think it's even better sometimes, of course, to just comply and understand that your time is out, you need to leave. And it's nothing to do perhaps with fear, but more with honoring the Genius Loci. And of course, there might be some instances where you just need to withstand it in order to get into that two-mindedness you speak. But do you have any experience with this the former thing I was speaking about?
Sure,
That
absolutely. And so you're going to get the telltale, the
yes,
raising of the hackles, the hair on the back of your neck, the chill up the spine, those kind of things. Again, you want to weigh those things. Other things can cause those. But in when uncanny synchronicities, and to a degree that you just know. And for me, I feel like I know when I guess I would say my own personal daemon or muse starts to speak.
yes,
Um, and I get what you're saying. I think that you have to be, so it's hard to, it can be hard to delineate um, when there's an opening of dialogue from an otherness. I think that dialogue again it's not going to feel very warm and comforting. You're not going to have those things. It's that its embrace is going to be abjection. So it is whether or not you can move forward into that abjection and not flee from it, not fall. Um, and with myself, I spoke of this again poetically in the lyrics. Like with myself, I find that I will have almost one aspect of myself that is kind of the dayside aspect, the rational, the worldly rational, um, that is being afflicted by this fear. Well, another, as that fear increases, that dread increases, another aspect of myself rises, that is rises in a state of furor and madness, and it is kind of the maniacal aspect that is grinning at this and saying yes, 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 push forward. uh, while while the former is being petrified, but that petrification allows the latter aspect of the self, which again um, we can connect to the one's own daemon in this regard. It allows it room to kind of take charge and take the helm and rise, and when it's typically hidden or slumbering or sleeping, and you have to rise in that increasing state of dread and panic, and even once that abjection has occurred, that is when the dayside ego self is just petrified and laid to rest through dread. It is put down through dread and fear, and the other arises. Now, another part you spoke of, which if I'm gathering, would be if you were to be in a space with said Genius Loci and it has cut off dialogue. Now,
yes.
if it is intentionally repelling you to that degree, I think that you'd probably be overcome by it anyhow. I mean, even when it's not, it's hard to maintain to a certain point before the cord breaks, right?
Yeah,
But if you were to determine, if you felt in your heart of hearts or your intuition or your daemon determines that dialogue has been shut, then yeah, I would highly recommend that you vacate the area.
yeah, I'm glad you understood what I was trying to convey, and it's basically Terence McKenna actually said once that he was speaking about psychedelic experience, which is another thing, and he said that if you are having a call with God and you just listened what the God, he was speaking metaphorically, of course, and not the Christian God. He said you listen what the God has to say, and then you switch off the line, and you'll be grateful. You don't keep up in the line and demand for more answers or something, because then somebody else might jump in the line. I would still clarify that in those instances I was speaking about something that the ride was already over and it was time for me to leave, and it was with like admiration and respect for the Genius Loci to leave. And I think another thing you mentioned about the two-mindedness is like a different thing. But anyway, I think our listeners got what I was trying to convey here.
Yeah, and in the lyrics I'm speaking of are from Nightbringer, actually, from
Yes,
Melon. Adorn me with the twain-minded mask of Janus. So referencing the god here and his two faces. And there is also a conception of Janus with not only the two faces, but a mysterious and unseen third face. And so I kind of like this idea because it speaks almost at what I was speaking about the egoistic dayside aspect of ourselves, and then you could say, I guess, a shadow self, or our aspect of that daemon, and then perhaps a third, if you are truly communing with something autonomous and outside yourself, then now you have three that come into play here, and then and then you could possibly manifest that third and hidden face of the Janus symbol.
This is really, really interesting, and it brings to my mind Carl Jung's. He had this idea called persona 1 and the persona 2. Are you familiar with that concept?
Yes, yeah, I am.
At one point, this is not from Jung, this is from my own thinking, that perhaps there was like a persona number 3, which is of course not a persona at all anymore. That would of course be the daimon, or something even beyond that, and that would be completely detached from any kind of human interaction and human thinking and this kind of thing.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. No,
And
that's
yeah,
very appropriate here.
that's absolutely fascinating also. And let me just ask you some specific questions about, now that I have the chance, from Gods Without Name. The title, yeah, I think it's very, very interesting in the sense that you are, of course, referring, because you are saying gods without a name, that they are still gods, but they don't have names because they are so ancient. Am I right?
Yes and no. I think
Yeah.
it does include that. So there was a Greek, and then I believe maybe even later into Roman practices. There was an observance that was done, especially when they're in foreign lands. I found it interesting, where they could petition or ask for passage into areas, or whatever it is. So in a foreign land, they would say, we I don't know what gods reside here. So they're gods without names, almost kind of a deus absconditus kind of falls in line to a degree here. But the unknowable or unknown presiding spirits. And now when I'm using the terms gods here, I'm using it in a context that you would find in, I had referenced this before, but Apuleius speaks about this, about how when certain Greeks would reference gods, they didn't always mean gods proper. They could also be referring to daemons.
Yes.
And so it can get a bit confusing, because they could refer to basically any spirit of the air or above, as a god, and so they aren't necessarily speaking of the gods proper in a platonic sense of the ultimate perfections. So here I was very much leveraging that. So it's very much, I guess you could replace it with spirits or daemons without
Yes.
name, which totally falls in line with the spirit of the place, right? Because typically you would not know a proper name for such an entity of otherness. So it is the gods without name.
Yeah, that was actually what I tried to say, but perhaps I stumbled in my words. But nice that you clarified. There's another thing in the album. There is Parallax Part 1 and Parallax Part 2, the intro and outro of the album, and I think they are absolutely spine-chilling. And I can't even say why, but I definitely see that they seem to. This is my imagination, that they happen in one particular room of the house. Am I
Sure.
right? Yeah.
Yeah. And again, I tend to when I enter into these things, even when I have like these deeper esoteric ideas, I always tend to frame them up poetically, of course, but also visually, almost like if I were to write a fiction novel around it. And I find myself in a place and setting, and with Gods Without Name, again, because I thought back so many times to my aunt and uncle's old farm and those old relics. And so it placed me into almost like a time period of the turn of the century, turn of the century America, like looking back through a lens into the from this perspective of now back to the time when these relics that inspired me for this album the time that they were, you know, inhabited. And you see that very much in the photos as well, right? So they look like old-timey, turn of the century, some kind of strange cult thing going on there with we did it at an abandoned farm, and used old farm tools that I also saw relevant with certain ritual fetishes, like the stang and the trident and the scythe and these kind of things. But anyhow, with the parallax, so when it starts, there's actually a sample of an old like a, I don't know if it's a dictaphone or it's basically an old time record player, right? That's kind of winding down, and so because I had again kind of artistically and poetically imagined this, you know, in this nighted house with the otherness creeping in, and this old record player winding down as you're looking out across the barren field and starting to feel that presence of the spirit of the place creeping in. And so that's really what I was trying to capture. But in my mind, and it's funny because I never know how this is going to be, you know, envisioned by others when they listen to it, but that's what I pictured. I pictured this, you know, early 1900s setting visually around these ideas, and that's why I did leverage that old record player sample and those kind of things and these aesthetic elements that I put in there that I wanted to be kind of a gothic Americana early 1900s vibe, just because that those images and those ideas seem to just fit what I was going for with this kind of dreadful ancient spirit.
I really get that. What does the parallax mean in this context?
So parallax, that's actually a phenomenon that occurs. Typically, you'll see it in like astronomy. It's how one thing is viewed from point A to point B, and how where it actually is in its position in space and time isn't actually for how you're perceiving it from point A to point B. So that's in its scientific term maybe might not be so interesting. So a lot of times you'll see this with like astral bodies. Things that appear on the horizon aren't exactly where they are because of distance. You know, so I could speak about that, but it would be less interesting. But I was kind of more interpreting the parallax in the esoteric kind of connotation of, you know, of I and other. From my point of view, no matter how it appears or where it appears or how you contextualize it, it's never exactly quite there. It's always kind of sort of out of your grasp of complete knowability.
I understand. That's very interesting. Thanks for sharing that.
Sure.
I think this is not directly related to Aoratos, and then again, it might be. And it's also related to Akhlys, of course. The significance of masks. For example, you have used the masks and these old clothes in Aoratos pictures and the photos, and you also use masks when you're playing live with Akhlys. And I know that's an interesting and aspect in your work.
Yeah, the masks are, you know, it's something that's important to me personally. Just one of those things that in out of all the, you know, various esoteric symbols that just really strikes close to home for me, and I've had a magnetism with. And so I see the mask is it's again it's this paradoxical thing, right? Because it at once conceals something while it reveals another, right? You're taking on another face while concealing. So anytime we hit these nodes of paradox, I always find them interesting. So yeah, so it's in my view, it's concealing the mundane face. Again, the egoistic dayside self is now being occulted, eclipsed, while you're bringing forward that demonic and wild and uncanny otherness, and as a kind of totemic fetish representation of that, and so that's why the masks are important to me. And we perceive anything that is emanating from the numinous is inevitably in its own right going to be a mask. It's going to change from one person to the other, so your experience of it is going to be very much personal. How it appears is that's the mask it has adorned for you. And then I like to strike out what is behind that mask, and then we're starting to approach the more numinous. In the lyrics again on Melano, it's a sardonic mask of night, beneath which is no thing, nous of the void, form changer. So again, it's very much a protean thing. It's a absolute absence behind that mask, but that absence is pregnant with uncanny presence of otherness.
I see. And it's also, of course, shamanic concept, like an ancient concept of wearing
Absolutely.
masks. I think even like everyday people might have some kind of understanding for this, even though they don't understand the esoteric leanings of this, for example, in the masquerades or whatever. And anonymity in the internet is also a mask. And the people tend to react and act differently when they are behind a mask.
You get to tailor that mask of ego and put forward your best foot and take time instead of just being right there in person. That's both the benefit and the drawback of stuff like social media, I suppose.
Yes,
because it's very self-tailored, right?
Yeah. It's interesting that about a year ago, I was visiting this local flea market, and there was this very grotesque wooden mask at sale. It cost only like 15 euros or something, and I immediately found it so interesting that I bought it, and I have used it in my ritual haunting crowds at the cottage. I have even gone to the sauna with the masks, and I have had it in some ritual work. And now that I have used it for many times, and I have kind of marinated or incubated by leaving it at the pit, that's my ritual place called, and for overnight, and for different places, in order it to gather this kind of, I wouldn't want to say energy, because that sounds too new ages, but you know what I mean. And
Sure.
it has really grown very important for me.
Yeah.
And right now it's in the darkness of the sauna as we speak. I left it there, and next time I go there, it's waiting for me. It's very important.
It becomes a lodestone of sorts.
Yeah,
and
like a totem.
Yeah, totemic lodestone of these things that were occurring while you're absent, and so it is an absence that it's kind of charging itself with, or however you want to put it, and then you adorn it, and then of course adorning it so many times. So that's great. That's a great bridge building of sorts between the I and the other, I would say. And I think doing those kind of things are very important.
Yeah. I have invented this concept of like a cathartic, a shamanic sauna, and it's pretty unorthodox in the sense that I have this big Bluetooth speaker, which is portable, of course, and
Sure.
it really can blast so loud that you can get hearing problems after a while. But anyway, that's a fucking idea at times, just to blare some music. For example, Akhlys, which I have used many times, so loud that it becomes the experience with the echoes in the wooden chamber of sauna, turns into like almost a violent experience. And I have used candles and like this kind of atmospheric force multipliers in the sauna. And with the mask, I have kind of stared through the masks in cathartic ritual, and I have poured water to the, I don't know what it's called, the fireplace of the sauna. And there's of course the mist, but it's really like a shamanic experience.
Sure, and I think that those kind of aesthetics, when approached correctly and a lot of time is put into it, of course, I mean that's the whole reason why there are totemic ritual tools, devices, fetishes, what have you. I think as long as it's not distracting you and sending you the wrong way, I think then that's always a good thing. And of course, I know some people prefer an absolute silence when doing these things. But I also think that, music, you could look at stuff like even rhythmic drums, right? So again, very
Yeah.
shamanic, and that can compel you forward into the certain state. For me, I couldn't listen to, and this is just me personally, I couldn't listen to, like, say, anything metal based because I would find it distracting. But I do, if I'm not doing it in silence, there are certain, like, ambient drone albums that I find end up assisting in that, just like a focal point of a ritual totemic fetish would. So of course, yeah, I mean, all these things can be very valid, and it just depends on how you connect with it and what you bring to it and what it does for you. If it's effective, it's effective.
Yeah, it's very subjective experience, and then there are, of course, different kinds of rights. For example, I really understand what you mean with the need of silence. That's important too. And I would have to say that Akhlys is the one and only like metal-based music I have ever used in any kind of ritual setting. But that's of course like a high compliment for Akhlys, because that I regard it's not music anymore. It's something else, and it's really like a personally meaningful for me, and
Well,
that is the reason I've used it.
yeah, that's great. I just certainly couldn't listen to my own stuff, because then I'd like,
Yeah,
that
I
was
understand.
be like, I could have done that better.
Yeah, you get too critical. I
Yeah.
know, know what you mean. A couple of years ago, I was just by some weird synchronicity introduced to Andrew Chambly and Cultus Sabbati, which I still don't know much about, but that's things which seem to pop up in my radar. For example, I think you yourself or Richard Gavin mentioned them in some other podcast, and many others. It's weird.
Yeah, Chumbly was one that I was introduced to by my bandmate Ophis Brian early on, so I was thankful for that. That was early 2000. I think it was like 2001, 2002. I believe 2002 Sethos edition came out, and I was actually able to attain this Sethos edition of Azawacha, and I was really just absolutely fascinated with Andrew Chumbly and the Cult of Sabbati, and hadn't really delved into that the concept of modern witchcraft, which is, I even hate using that term. It's such a loaded term, especially now.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was absolutely fascinated in the same way I was with like Austin Awesome Spare, where what he was striking at also, funny enough, it resonates with even certain Platonists that I find such value in, like Plotinus and Iamblichus, and but outside of that traditional context and just his approach to it and everything, it just really spoke to me. Also, his artistry is just absolutely uncanny, and his knack for verse and prose is second to none. And so you just saw all these elements culminate in these works, and so they still are some of the most important to me today.
Yeah, I understand. It's so interesting that it's like a acquired taste, but still, I think people who are into this kind of thing have really like delved deep, because that's not something you just happen to pass by if in the mainstream esoterica, of course.
Yeah, it's a very rare individual to begin with, but very rare works, especially in modern occultism, which is quite stumbling for the most part. And then you have these certain individuals that are just seem to have been really illuminated. And Chumbly was certainly one of those. And Chumbly has had a huge influence on my work, especially lyrics and verbiage and ideas. So yeah, I'll always honor the legacy of Chumbly.
I think in Nightbringer's Ego Dominus Tools album there were some references to
Yeah, there's been
Tumblr.
Chumbly since forever, uh, and that comes from both me and my the aforementioned bandmate Ophis, who introduced me to Chumbly amongst others. But yeah, even to this day, it's still very much, a lot of things I do are still very much in that wheelhouse of the Cult of Sabbati tradition.
Another thing I found recently is goetheia.com. Do you know the Frater Archer?
Yeah, I'm familiar with him. I have not read his books, but I'm definitely interested in reading his books. But yeah, no, I know, I am familiar.
Yeah, and the Goetheia, the ancient Greek version, not the Goetheia of what people know more about, but I think it's very fascinating. I don't know that much about it, but I read the goetheia.com website, and there was this one essay which was really, really interesting. And I mean, it's just fascinating that this kind of maybe witchcraft or however you would want to call it, like some kind of shamanic sorcery or chthonic sorcery was practiced so long ago.
Yeah, well, I think that there's so if you want to look at this critically from a historical stance, which many do, and they'll say witchcraft never existed, um, was not a thing. I think they're misunderstanding from step one. I like when Chumbly and other cultists of bodies members reference it as the nameless faith. I think that's maybe a little more on point. And of course, they had no idea how loaded the term witchcraft would become today, but that it's not it's not an orthodoxy. It's if anything, it's a heterodoxy. But that these are more, I guess you could say, primordial practices and beliefs that arise on the outskirts through all times and places and cultures, and they reside in the liminal, and they aren't nailed down by an orthodoxy and a specific tradition per se. These are the cunning men that were and women that were living on society's edge, and could have even included dual observances with orthodoxies like Christianity and whatnot. But that's really what I think they're getting at, is these things that can't really be nailed down in that fashion, but are very much perennial and really timeless. Can't be nailed down by time or culture or place, but exist in all, on the cusp, in the shadows at all times. And that's how I see that definition of witchcraft.
It's great that you brought up the liminal, that these practitioners are always been in the liminal. And it's like, I think the root of all religions lie in some kind of animistic shamanism. And I think this is just something, if the societies would like totally collapse and we would have this kind of shamanistic witchcraft or whatever type of thing, the Genius Loci would just emerge again all over the place, everywhere. And to add
Yes.
some levity over here, because this is quite heavy stuff. I mean, like in modern architecture, the Genius Loci term is still used. Did you know about that?
Yeah, I do, and
Yeah.
and it's used in such a kind of profane way.
Yeah.
This loci of, it's almost like it's almost like how the modern thinking of feng shui, right? They're like,
Yeah.
oh, make my house look more comfortable, and it's like, okay, well, you've stripped out all the heart of this and just left the outer shell, and that's what you're going for. Or like soccer moms doing yoga or something.
Really well said.
Okay, well, yeah, you've got one little remnant of this, and it's the least important. But whatever, you use that, I guess. But yeah, no, I've seen the term used, and so it's funny because it will confuse people sometimes, because I'm less aware of these more common usages, and so when I start speaking about these things, people can think I'm speaking about something entirely different, and I'm like, no, I don't give a shit about the I'm not putting all my time and effort into the welcoming aesthetic of my home. I'm talking about something different.
I think it's the same with ecstasy. The word's etymology and the original concept, that is kind of like a pet peeve of mine, in the sense that I find it infuriating that people tend to associate ecstasy with like eating a lot of chocolate, or something like that. The
Yeah,
hedonistic pleasures.
yeah, and that's just the world we reside in at this.
Yeah, that's Kali Yuga.
It's called. I always say that it turns everything to its most base aspect, and so, someone watches pornography and they say it was ecstasy, and it's like,
Yeah.
okay, now again you've missed the heart of it entirely, or so it's unfortunate. And so I do intentionally not use the common spelling and term. I usually go back to the Greeks with the K, with the ecstasis, at least to confound those people that have maybe more a modern mindset. So they're like maybe not familiar with that term. I'm like, I'd rather you not know what I'm talking about than plate it with something that it's absolutely not. So
that's a good practice. I'm going to use that too in the future because I really can't stand the modern interpretation of ecstasy. Okay, we can turn the page and start to speak more about Akhlys, if you will. And in the debut album Supplication, it caught my attention a couple of years ago, and it featured an old witch-like woman. What does it represent for you?
So it's funny because I actually made that cover. Well, made loosely termed. I was actually so that was a long time ago. I was actually in college and I was doing graphic design, which was a disaster in itself. But it's kind of funny because it is a digital image based off of actual images, like actual pictures. I'm not a huge fan for the most part of digital art. There are very select few digital artists that I really like. Outside of that, I in my older age, I'm not a fan. But anyhow, so it was a bit ironic that that's how that began. But I really was merging together these old photos that I came across of these kind of old, matronly, haggard-looking, kind of crone-looking figures, and then gave it this kind of green sheen because I saw that as like a good representation for the figure of Akhlys, which when you read like Hesiod or any of the descriptions of Akhlys, the figure is very much a crone-like, almost necrotic witch type figure. And so really I was just trying to aesthetically represent that. And I think I merged like 3 different photos together when I did that and kind of came up with my own thing and distorted it. And then the Viridian kind of green light, which is, paradoxically again, is this, green is associated, and a color associated with fecundity, which we could say is like life, especially like its connection to like plants and nature, but it's also equally connected with death. And so it's that yellow and green was also seen by the Greeks as a color of decomposition because that's the color the corpse is turned. You see this with Melano too, is it has those same kind of depictions of this corpse-like color. And also with that fecundity comes rot. So there's, and again, I spoke of, I like these kind of paradoxical symbols that they project in directions at once, they represent their opposites. And I think that a singular symbol that represents its opposites is usually the most potent, the most powerful, and the most intriguing. So that's where I came at the that's the direction I was coming at for that album cover.
Okay, that's interesting. And it's also of note that all of the 3 Akhlys albums feature this kind of crowned-looking, or at least sinister-looking portrait of a woman.
Yeah, feminine.
Yeah. Yes.
So the the feminine is a important symbol with anything chthonic or dark, generally speaking. The wild feminine unchecked, the Shakti, is the chaotic force and is always going to be associated with the chthonic and the grave and death and darkness and of course night and the moon and the ocean and on and on and on.
What was the second album, The Dreaming Eye? Is the cover made by Dennis Forkas Construmitin as in the Melino?
No, it's actually David Furoris did that.
Oh,
cover.
I know him, yeah.
Yeah, and that was a commission based on ideas, basically based on the exact same thing. So, so there's definitely a similarity, obviously, when you look at all 3 covers. So I feel that at this point it almost makes like a triune, which I like. And so you got 3 faces, and we can tie this to like symbols like Hecate. I think at this point, I probably it's time to move on from that. I don't want every album to be the feminine crone face. I think that it's where it exists now is perfect, and I'll move on from here. But yeah, no, I mean those three are similar, and I think that they link to each other nicely.
Like a trio of chthonic nymphs.
Yes,
Yes.
exactly. You find that symbolism of three within that same
Yes.
kind of symbolism with the dark feminine. So I felt it was appropriate.
I really dig that. I
And
actually have one interesting, like I think you might find this amusing, and also the bit more levity, like in between this episode. And this is a, I know you are intrigued by sleep paralysis, and I
yeah,
actually have a sleep paralysis story to share involving the dreaming eye. I'm still digesting the album, and I was at the cottage, and I believe it was winter and very dark, and in the evening, and I was lying on my back with these noise cancelling headphones. I used to listen to music, and because with that I really can immerse into the music without any outside distractions. And I was listening to the album, and the music melded with my hypnopompic visions in the sleep paralysis. And in the dream, I was wandering in my apartment building's corridors filled with a blue sinister haze. I believe consummation was playing deafeningly loud all around me. And at first, I thought it would wake up the whole neighborhood. But then the absurdity of the situation triggered a sadistic glee within me, and I began laughing in what seemed like a demented ecstasy. And when I finally woke up, I was still grinning. And thanks for that experience. But it was like horrifying, and in a dark way, it was amusing because it was so
yeah.
like kind of a taboo breaking. It was, to cause this kind of like a absurd disturbance for the whole block with Akhlys.
Yeah, no, that's great. And it's funny when we come out of these things sometimes, whether it's like, more of a trance state or a dream, and they can be very potent. And then when you verbalize them, they can have a bit of absurdity, which you always have to grin at a little bit.
I have had so many like sleep paralysis over the years that I think I'm bit jaded to the experience, and it doesn't feel that disturbing for me anymore because I kind of know how the dance goes. But at the first, when I got my first sleep paralysis, I didn't even know what that was about. I think that I was like maybe 8 years old or something, and
Sure.
it was really like fucking alien abduction or something. It was so horrifying and so ecstatic in the old use of the term. And afterwards, I have had in my adult life, I think I was 20 or something, where I used to have like many of these. I had these absolutely outlandish apocalyptic visions, and they were like so inspiring artistic wise. And I know that you have had them yourself
Oh yeah,
a
absolutely.
lot. Yeah.
And sleep paralysis is funny because today it gets a lot of criticism, and it's been definitely analyzed psychologically and scientifically. And it seems like there's a consensus almost that they've come to the conclusion that we know exactly what sleep paralysis is. There's nothing uncanny about it. We can tell you exactly what happens during the body, the brain, and why this occurs. And then they go into this scientific diatribe on, how the body shuts down the motor system during sleep. So to try and keep you from sleepwalking, really, so you don't hurt yourself when you're dreaming. And that all makes sense, and that's all fine and good. And then they leave it at that. And there have been I like to read on this and read from the other side. And there are some more recent studies on sleep paralysis, where what they haven't struck at is why the hypnopompic and hypnagogic visions, right? And so there are some real attempts there, from the scientific and psychological community to resolve that. And I still don't feel it's very resolved. I don't feel it's sufficient. Um, and a lot of it, I'd read a recent paper where, and again, it's this guy's theory, and it's a solid theory, like I'll give him that, but that, you know, the semi-wakefulness, since your eyes are open a lot in these events, you're perceiving, and then your brain is still coming out of REM, that the theory here is that you're doing both at the same time. You're perceiving your environment while dreaming, right? That still is lacking a lot of explanation around it, especially the cross-cultural stuff, with the uncanny presence and how that presence manifests. Some of these things I can give ground on, like which doesn't typically occur with me, but a lot of people where the entity sits on the chest, right? Well, it's restricted breathing, which we can look at scientifically again. Those things make sense to me, and that's all fine and good, but it still doesn't dismiss the meaning of it, I suppose. Also, the cross-cultural similarities are so nuanced, and there's so many of them that it would be hard to just explain away that way. So yeah, it's interesting to see these things are like dismissed. There's like even some like more like mundane, like I'll listen to like paranormal podcasts or whatever, and you know, certain of these podcast individuals will dismiss all this stuff right away. They're like, oh, that's sleep paralysis, we know what that is. That's not paranormal, that's not uncanny, and it's like, well, you're kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater here, with these explanations and papers that still aren't really striking at the core of the issue, I suppose. So yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting thing. I think anytime that you'd have to explain away any trance state at that point, even going into stuff like meditation, and try and reduce it all down to profane worldly means. But I mean, that's also what the scientific community is all about. Like that's their objective, right? And even with modern psychology, that's kind of the objective there. Another one is saying that the entity that emanates dread is based on a fear of intrusion. And it's like, well, if it was just about an intruder, why aren't all these people why isn't there wild differences? Like some people are dreaming about, or not dreaming, but experiencing during sleep paralysis, a literal intruder coming in with, you know, a crowbar and a black mask. Like you do not see that.
Yeah.
You see a shadow figure, or even something as specific as a man wearing a hat. And it's like, how are you going to do this cross-culturally? It's not culturally bound. I think the best person to still look at to counterbalance that is David Hufford. David Hufford spent his whole life working on this. He has the most definitive book on it, and he is not an occultist by any means. He just states the facts and presents them, and his conclusion is kind of like, I don't know. It is uncanny, and here's why it's uncanny, and here's why these arguments of, you know, anything from schizophrenia to the things I just mentioned, like, aren't sufficient. They don't address enough points to just pass it off as resolved. So yeah, I definitely recommend David Hufford, The Terror That Comes in the Night. Great fucking book. So it makes me think of another thing, just in large, any of these kind of criticisms. I don't think that denying one thing, or if we realize one thing, it doesn't necessarily deny the other, right? Like, especially when we're coming into looking at psychological modes, or even scientific biological modes, I would never say that these things are not part of it. There is a psychology that occurs. There are biological things that occur during sleep paralysis, and same with meditation, right? And it's like, obviously we're not saying that those things aren't valid or those things do not occur, but they're one smaller piece of a greater whole. And really, it's like, so if we look at meditation, there are things that happen with the body and the mind, and then again psychologically when you enter into meditation. Saying that does not mean that it dismisses any other possibilities or any other piece that is included. I think what this does is put you into a favorable mode to experience something more subtle, and to experience something possibly numinous. And so it's kind of pointless to analyze these things on the scientific playing field, because the scientific playing field is limited by its own means, and so it's not going to consider things outside of that, outside of the scientific possibility or the what it's termed the dayside rationality.
Absolutely, and I think the tendency of modern science to reduce everything into like this kind of neat packages is a big problem, in the sense that at least if you think about the original mission of science, it's always changing. It's a hypothesis, and just some people tend to view science as religion, and I think they are the problem, not the scientists. And
Yeah,
anyway,
sure.
yeah.
Kind of. I mean, I understand it, and I understand why people come from that position. Sure, it's good to be rational, but yeah, again, it's already cast out certain possibilities from the onset, and so the whole point is the only things that exist are things that are observable, reducible, categorizable, the quantitative, and so. I can again go look back to Guinan, the reign of quantity, the problem of quantitative versus qualitative. It doesn't account for anything qualitative, which is a whole vast experience of life itself. So yeah, it can be problematic, and I'm certainly not anti-science by any means. I think it's very important and brings us many, many benefits. But once we start to get into these kind of discussions, it can be very limiting.
Yeah, I believe the thing I was referring to was scientism. So that's basically like science as a religion. And I think rationality and science is a great tool, like you said, but that doesn't end there. And I think for a visionary artist like ourselves, I think sleep paralysis and this kind of parasomniac anomalies are like great stuff. They are great source of inspiration.
Sure. And I mean, I've had sleep paralysis that's also led into out of body experience, is another good example. And out of body experience is interesting because anybody that's experienced it, you wake up and you go to that location, and then you're like, I mean, every little nuance is exactly the same from a location that you weren't just in, even to the lighting, the clouds out the window, and of course, you can take a rationalistic approach and say, well, then you must have saw it before you went to sleep. But what if I said I didn't? I did not. I slept long enough that the day changed, and I observed these things 3 different times before I arose and went out and saw that it was exactly that atmosphere to the T. And then they could counter argument that with, well, then you must have slept walk and observed it and walked back. You just chase your tail forever on this, but
Yeah.
At the end, it's like, we're dealing with subjectivity, so it's going to confound the argument at some point, and you're not going to come to a conclusion. You just have to be okay with just like, I don't fucking care. I don't. Someone can argue with me all day long, and I really don't care. Like if someone was able to present something so solid that just turned my world upside down, but it's not even possible, so it's kind of pointless.
If these esoteric methods work, they work. It's like there's no need to dissect them every time. I think we can move on a little. This was really fascinating, of course, but there's still more. Yeah, we can turn into Melino proper. To our listeners, I might mention that Melino was named after the Greek underworld goddess associated with nightmares and madness. This is really fascinating. Is actually Melino like an epithet for Hecate?
I mean, I think that would be conjecture. I think
Yeah.
that they could definitely propose a good argument for that. There's not enough historically to make any tie.
Yeah. It's evident that in your works, for example, in Melino, there's lots of references to the Greek mythos, and that's also has been very fruitful to our collective. And it's like you cannot escape the Greek mythos.
Well, it's such a pillar of not just Western history and mythology, but also the Western mindset, even our own, again, psychology as a Westerner. It's going to resonate typically with people that have that Western mindset already in their subconscious.
It's like the source of many things. We
Sure.
kind of owe a lot to the Greek mythos. Some interesting details. Two distinct songs in Melino. For example, in Pnigalion, around the 6 minute 20-second mark, there's a compelling section where you recite the lyrics. This has been the most intriguing musical, magical, and somehow liminal experience I ever had with any this kind of music. This has been truly magical for me. You recite something like this: radiant in waves of darkness, black static scintillations, cascading abyss, drown me in madness, Furoris Divinales. And your voice is very affected in that part, and the riff which is playing in the background, I always get these cold shivers when listening to it. I really need to know what is this about. Do you agree that that's a special kind of the high place of that song?
Yeah, things are really culminating at that point in the song, so it's kind of reaching this apex there. So
Yes, apex.
of course, accompanied by very dramatic vocal stylization there. And it's me again trying to poetically describe things that you can't really describe so much discursively. So that kind of scintillating darkness was kind of the best way I can relay that in words, what I've experienced, and so again, the best way to do that is poetically, artistically, and apparently it works because people.
Yeah.
It reverberates with people, at least the right people. So that's good to know. But that's when things are culminating and about to kind of also crash down. When it reaches a quick little bridge there and goes into the part where I say the previous lyrics I recited, which end with form changer.
Yes.
And then the riff kind of goes down into like kind of the outro part, which gets real heavy. So it kind of culminates and then crashes down into this really heavy, dark part. And then the shade shifter piece. I think that's one of the probably the most effective parts of the album. One of the ones I was most pleased with and the most dramatic, and it just really just ended up kind of being very magical in that sense. So yeah,
it definitely is, and I urge the listeners to really check that timestamp of 6 minute 25 seconds mark and really listen it with good headphones. You will get what we are talking about. And then there's another song that is the final song of the album, Incubo, or was it Incubation?
Incubatio.
Sorry, Incubator. Sorry, that's on me. I think this track is the most majestic in the album, like an anthem. And around 5 minute mark, there's this vertigo-inducing barrage of riffs that feels like succumbing to a divine madness, and it's intoxicating in its visionary power. This is from my own remarks for this episode. There is also this touch of genius, and I mean in the Roman original sense. And it feels like if your music is visionary enough and it resonates with the listener, it can really spin your head, so to speak. You almost get this psychedelic effect that you are like losing your consciousness. You are like almost like fainting. It's so powerful, It's kind of strangling you in a good sense. It's
yeah, and
pretty
that's
weird.
that kind of furor. I like that
Yes.
term. It kind of is. I think that's sufficient. That's what I go for, and that's what I felt when I was doing these things, or when I play them, and everything just kind of clicks. Is it has that feeling of furor, which
Yes.
is kind of a brother or married to madness.
Divine madness. This was it Theia mania in the Greek.
Yeah, the Daimonia, and then we can link back to the Daemon. So
Yes,
the Daemon
that's
and the melancholics and the poets and the artists and.
Are you perhaps reading my script? Because that's of course that's what's coming up next. But let me just recite the lyrics of that particular section of the song, because this is just absolutely amazing. And if you hear these lyrics in the song, you know about that's the exact section I'm talking about. It goes like this, and this is really electrifying. I have become Incubo, and my aspect is horror. Her dreadful piping awakens the shadow within me.
And that piping, so I'm drawing upon a work by Peter Kingsley, Dark Places of Wisdom.
Oh.
And he talks about the Syrinx, which there's multiple definitions here. The Syrinx was the pipe of Pan. It was called the Syrinx. It was also a nymph was called Syrinx, so you have that. But the sound of that piping was also related to the wheels of the individual in I want to say it's is it Parmenides? I think Parmenides.
Yeah.
When he travels to the underworld before the unknown goddess, who is likely Persephone, and the wheels of his chariot create this rhythmic piping sound that he relates to the Syrinx, and that piping has been equated with this kind of heightened state of meditation where people feel they are spinning or whirling and then hear an audible sound of this rhythmic piping. And then again, connecting it back to Pan, who is seen as kind of the god or daemon par excellence of nightmares and dread, and then his piping. And so that's what that's referencing there. So every word I try and be very intentional about and have either dualistic or multiple meanings that are kind of painting the entire picture. So yeah, I was very careful in the construction of the lyrics around these things.
I understand. What was the book by James Hillman about Pan?
Pan and the Nightmare.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
James
need to look
Hillman.
it up. Yeah.
Yeah, so James Hillman was a depth psychologist, very much in the wheelhouse of Carl Jung. And so I find, even though it's not esoteric per se, I feel like the depth psychology gets right on the cusp of the esoteric. A lot of times it's can be translated that way easily. So I really like Hillman's work, and there's a lot of resources and references that you won't find elsewhere that are really great, that are very relevant to the ecstatic dread, the sacred horror, and then of course Pan, the god or pseudo god, that part of his portfolio is dread and abjection, and of course nightmares.
Most people don't even associate Pan with nightmares, I believe. I mean, the modern people who are not into mythology and history, they might think it's just some kind of like a funny figure. Even that's absurd, but anyway, that's how it is.
Well, it's almost like, because he's funny because he's a trickster icon. So
yeah,
like Loki, right? Or like if we look at the tarot, like the Fool, right? But yet
yes.
the Fool is the wisest of them all, right? So it's almost like this Harlequin jester character that is up to mischief at all times, up to mischief. But that's the veneer, that's the first mask. But behind that is that sardonic grin, and that sardonic grin is sort of all-knowing doom. That you would have to encounter that to pass beyond that sardonic grin, and to enter into that embrace would lead to an elation that would lead to like an ecstatic numinous experience, almost like a guardian. He's fooling you. He's the trickster. He's the riddler.
Yeah, the trickster, like with the world-ending grin. I once studied this trickster archetype a lot, and it's endlessly fascinating. But yeah, I think we can move on, like you just said, to the Daimon and the Muse, because that's absolutely intriguing subject. I believe I have talked with all of my former guests. That's something that really pops up every time, and with a good reason. I have listened probably all and read all of your interviews beforehand, and you have mentioned that when you are in the creative process, you sometimes forget to eat and the mundane business when you are like composing riffs and some concept to the album. And I really know what's that about, and that's like a part and parcel of visionary artist. And I find it very fascinating to hear that there is somebody else who is just as obsessed with his art as you.
Yeah, well, I think that when you hit the point where things really click into place is when you've reached a point of absolute obsession. And so in that point of obsession, that's when the personal muse or daemon starts to speak. And so then your sustenance is that. Everything else is insufficient anyways, and you've forgotten about it. So you might not shower, you might not sleep, you might not eat food, because you are so caught up within that window of this obsession taken to its apex. And that's when the best things occur. That's also, again, a hallmark of when you know that you're doing things correctly. Is when that's what I call the muse speaking, is when you've forgotten about the world around your immediate world and you're just singularly, almost autistically focused on this one thing.
Yes, definitely. I think even the autistic trait, which I think it's more prevalent in men, somebody had studied, I don't know if this is a scientific study or anything, said that it may have had a relation to groups of men hunting to have a singular, like monomanic concentration to the one thing. I think that's just a trait we have to live with, and it's a good trait to have if you happen to be a visionary artist. And
Yeah.
I can give you one example when I really understood this daimonic. It's not possession aspect, but I call it the daimonic imperative. Around 6 to 7 years ago, when the old cottage was demolished, I dug up like a little hole in the ground to make a fireplace. And to cut a long story short, after 6 years, I have spent countless of hours just digging the ground, making new shrines and whatnot. And the pit, like I used to call it, it's almost like a mycelium or something, and it's covering now maybe 60 to 80 square meters of ground. And all the work I have done there has been so taxing and above my level, so to speak. I mean, I have forgot to eat and I don't feel any pain. And afterwards, I have had many hours of work, like digging and moving stones and whatever. I have been absolutely devastated in the following night and got almost like a fever of the physical. It was so taxing physically, but it has been worth that. And the next day, I have been completely dumbfounded. What the hell happened? What took over me? And of course, there's this. It's very inspiring to see all the work. But I mean, in any kind of modern setting, like in the city where I live normally, I could never do that kind of stunts. And I think you really know what I mean.
Yeah, well, that's why
Yeah.
I live rurally.
Yeah.
Purposely so. It's important to me to be away from all that. But yeah, I think that really, if you want your diamond to speak to you, you have to give it utmost attention, and that's what it demands. And you have to rise to its level. It's not going to descend to you. And once you are in that dialogue, it demands your utmost attention. So even the most basic things go by the wayside, like eating. If you want to, and so that's why we do this. That's why you don't sleep, and that's why you don't eat, is because you don't want to interrupt that dialogue.
Yeah.
And of course, you can only take this so far, and it's highs and lows, right? It's almost like a drug, because once you come out of that, whether it's hopefully it's for a short period and you rekindle that flame quickly and continue on, but inevitably there will be a point where that dialogue is finished for now, and you have to go through the melancholia of being divorced from that until situation and circumstance and mindset is right for it to rise again. And this is why I think with the Greeks, they say the melancholics, the melancholia, the black bile of the four humors was so integral to the greatest artists and poets. You have to pay the devil his due, and you're going to bottom out and be in this woeful state once you are cut off from it for a time. And you should pine to get that back, and because you have to achieve its attention again. So it's kind of cyclic in that manner. and it's not just a repose of bliss by any means. It is taxing, and even the greatest artists at some point, some of them fall out of it completely. They just can't rise to it again, even after great art, and that is the price that you have to pay sometimes.
I find this very familiar, and one could probably call that like a Nightbringer process or incubation, between these
Yeah, of the
daimonic
soul.
imperatives. I have used this term like an occult hangover or the occult overdose or temporary burnout to refer to the same phenomenon. And it's like it always happens when you have had particularly strong daimonic imperative. And I think it's related to a human body and mind. It's just there are no free lunches, and that's the price you have to pay. But luckily, it always seems to come back, or it has.
Yeah, and so you have to see those moments of time as a blessing, because it's not going to last permanently.
Yeah.
At least not in this mode. We could speak of preparing ourselves on an initiatic path towards our death, which that's a different thing. But for now, to borrow the tongue of the divine, even for a moment, is that's a great thing. If you're able to even approximate something like that, there's going to be a bottoming out after that, and so you just have to recognize that's just a part of the process.
Just like a mundane hangover, you have to
Yeah.
tough it out. It's
Exactly.
a price you have to pay. And this is really interesting in the sense that I know from a prior interview, I think it was in Soul Knox, maybe it was the Sacred Horror episode with Richard Gavin, you mentioned that you have probably recently discovered the work of Matt Cardin.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And
the horror fiction. Yeah.
Yeah. And he's quite an interesting character in the sense that I have known him from some 20 years now. I think he ran the website, not personally, but I know the figure. And I think he ran thomasligotti.net or ligotti.net, the website, the Ligotti archives. Yeah, back in the day. And I think I might have had some like a slight correspondence with him. I don't remember anymore. But anyway, I just got reintroduced to his work, and he has this absolutely great guide. It's called A Course in Demonic Creativity, a writer's guide to the inner genius. And in the guide, it's only like less than 200 pages, so a quick read. And he talks about incubation, so that the process of incubation or the Nightbringer process is actually a very important thing. It's like a gestation or something, incubation.
Yes.
And it's important. And I think some artists, if they lose the faith, so to speak, in the Daimon, that can be a very damning and depressing time if they don't understand that there is stuff happening in the background, in the subconscious.
Well, I think that the Daimon appreciates toil,
Yeah.
And in that sense, it's again equated to the trickster. It appreciates toil and hardship and misery. And again, that's the toll that you pay the devil. And I also think that this is why maybe it's for some people that they eventually maybe get exhausted. And so if we look again back to Akhlys, his conception of the daemon, that if you just give in, you say it's too hard, I've toiled enough, then your daemon can actually abandon you, and then you're fucked. Then you're just you're
definitely are.
Yeah, you're left out to sea. So and trust me, I've gone through this so many times, especially after taking breaks from writing an album and being in that mindset. It's hard to get back into it, and it could take months and months and months. And I've written so many things that I'm just like, it's good. Like I'll even send this to my friends, and I always appreciate like the honest feedback of friends, and someone will be like, it's good. It's good. It's not great, and it's like, fuck, that took me fucking 3 months to write that. But I also knew in my heart of hearts that it wasn't great. And I was almost looking for someone else's excuse to be like, oh, it's amazing, So it's good I don't have those friends that are going to bullshit me.
Yeah.
Because I did know in my heart of hearts that it wasn't there. And then it's just like you got to spend more time and more time and more time. And of course, you go through the dark night of the soul where you start to think, what if I can't do it again? What if I just absolutely can't do it? And especially in music, you can look at artists that like have gone on for 20 or 30 years, like, and you're like, that's great, but your music's not that great anymore. It's like you guys burned out fucking 15 years ago with whatever last album, and it's been kind of mediocre from there. And what a terrible fate. Like, I'd rather just like disappear into the night than do that. But so these are the things you juggle, and you'll never quite know. I mean, you could even think that something's amazing, and then 3 months later you realize like, now after some time away, it's not quite what I thought it was. And then you can have the opposite. You can do something in a very short amount of time that's absolutely inspired. That's just the way these things work. It's very volatile, and it's very, happenstance, and there's a lot of things that go into it, and time and place and will and inclination. But this is the thorn strewn path that you have to just tread until you're fucking glorious or bitter end.
It's so fascinating that even Stephen King and Nick Cave have talked about their muse and how, like you said, volatile it is. It's you really have to honor it. You have to somehow. I mean, like it's not to be toyed with. It's not your fucking workhorse or something.
Yeah, and Peter Kingsley talks about a term called kuros. I don't know if I'm saying it correctly, but it means youth, grossly, but it more means like vitality, and that's like the ultimate state to enter into any of these things is like at the peak of your spiritual vitality. And again, this also can be linked grossly to actual age, and I think that's why you find a lot of artists in their younger age tend to make more creative works, because they have that kuros spirit, that vitality that's mirrored in their actual physical vitality and in their mental and spiritual vitality. What you'd want to do from there is springboard off that and learn enough to crystallize that and hold on to it and cultivate it into your elder ages, becoming more sagely and not just letting that flame kind of diminish. But that's a tricky thing. I mean, you're in your 40s as well. There is an aspect of real world vitality that does start to decline, and you have to really work harder to stoke that flame and keep it alive. And not to say it can't be done, it could absolutely be done. There's plenty of poets and writers and what have you, painters that do some of their best work in their twilight years. So, but they're the ones that learn from previous things, where maybe things before were more lightning in a bottle, and then they learned how to capture that and distill it.
Yeah, I think Cormac McCarthy comes to my mind. He must be like a 90 or something nowadays.
Yeah, and he just finally released another book. One of the greatest American writers. Cormac McCarthy is genius. But then again, I can still say Blood Meridian, like that's his shining gem, and I don't know if he's ever topped that one, but.
One interesting thing or topic is that in your prior interviews you have talked about the age of COVID. I mean, when there was this mandatory isolation and quarantine, that I think you created the Melinome album during that time.
Yes.
Yeah, and I don't think normal people tend to think that isolation and this kind of thing is it's horrifying. They avoid that at all costs. But for an artist, if you really have, if you are in connection with your Daimon, that can be a very fruitful period. I refer that as a catabasis, and I think that's a good term for it. And just more than a couple of years ago, I embarked on catabasis to the cottage where I had never spent time alone. And I went there with my 2 dogs, and they were enough of a company for me. And that was really like a kind of like a distilled Jungian individuation process. It was at times even harrowing, but I have never produced so high quality and strong art than during that time, because I was completely detached from the maladies of the city and the modern life.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm one who certainly, I don't know if this just makes me amongst the minority, but I'm a person that isn't very sociable typically, especially the older I get. And I do appreciate alone time. I like being alone. I like being out away, especially from like urban chaos and those kind of things. And the more time, I mean, so in a way, as fucked up as COVID was, I was pretty thrilled at the same time. I was like, this is great. Like, I even stuff like you can't go to the grocery store now. I'm like, great, perfect excuse not to have to go be in the world. Yeah. So no, I totally get that. And, you know, I mean, I've even spent time, unfortunately, incarcerated, but I kind of loved it because I had a jail cell by myself. So I was like, you know, these things, you know, like that wasn't the best circumstance for that, obviously, but still got some, you know, there's some fruit that I drew from that. But I do appreciate being alone, and I think it's very important, especially spiritually. You'll find this is a common thread. We could look at another figure that's very important to me, Henry Corbin. Wrote "Alone with the Alone," so I think that phrase says it all. The longer you're alone with your thoughts and yourself, the more you'll discover about yourself. And not only that, but it'll move you to a point where you can start to be alone with something that maybe is not yourself, and start to have some resonance with that. So I think it's very important, and that's why you have, you know, these traditions that are like, I don't know, like sequestered monks and those kind of things, where they purposely remove themselves from the world at large.
I really know about that kind of thing because it's again it's like an age-old type of method, and I think that was really interesting that you said that when you spend alone, when you have lots of alone time, I mean in the good like profound sense, it's fascinating what you can find in your own mind, what kind of old demons come at play in that kind of monastic lifestyle. Also during winter because it's always dark. And when I was having, I think it was the winter of 2021, and it was like the whole cottage was enveloped by this like primordial darkness at times, because in Finland it really gets dark during winters, and it was like drinking some kind of strong alcoholic beverage with lots of quantities that it's coming from my own mind. It was like intoxicating. It was harrowing, you know.
Yeah, it's the nepenthe of darkness and solitude. And yeah, I've actually spent a lot of time in Finland. And I love you know, that's what I love about it. I've been there in both seasons where the sun doesn't fucking go down, and that I mean, that's still, I find it very fascinating, and it's pretty cool. But it's kind of like this day has never ended, and but then the opposite where, you know, it's just darkness, and I fucking absolutely love that. I'm like, is there a place on the earth that I can reside where the sun just doesn't come up? I'll just move there.
Yeah, welcome to Finland.
Yeah.
I think it's called Kamos, the perpetual darkness which lasts for many months in a row in the Lapland, the northern region of Finland. And I think it's interesting that what people kind of do in order to counter that, they drink lots of booze, of course. And I can believe it will turn very psychedelic after a couple of months of total darkness.
Well, and you know, just that's the uncanniness about nighttime is
Yeah.
it tends to take away at least a portion of the waking world, and submerges, excuse me, a lot of that kind of that rational thinking and that mode that you exist in. It veils it in a bit of mystery, right? So just because the unseen becomes your palpable reality. And so that's why nighttime obviously is such a significant thing, symbolically. But yeah, I think I would flourish in a place like that. I would have a harder time during the summer,
Yeah.
but yeah, that was interesting. You know, I spent some time in Iceland and Norway and Sweden, and spent more time in Finland, and I've experienced both ends of it. And I always find it fascinating just to watch the sun be at its zenith, and then like it's going down, it's twilight, and then it just goes up, and it's like no nighttime.
Yeah.
And then the opposite, where you've got only 4 or 5 hours of daytime, and then it's just night, and you feel like it's 3 a.m, and it's only 8 p.m.
Yeah, it seems to really fuck up your circadian rhythm, I think, or something like that in
Yeah.
people. Yeah. And I think most Finnish people find it like a hard time to suffer that. But when I have grown older, I appreciate more the winters because the contrast, I mean, summer is conventional, you can use shorts and whatever, it's easier. But I think in winter time at the cottage where nobody else wants to live but me, it's like it's a snow plowing and whatnot, it's like you're really in touch with the elements, and the contrast and the catharsis is great. It's very stark.
Well, you become a bedfellow of darkness for sure. I mean, when you're spending in darkness, and to me that sounds divine. I would I would probably be the most inspired, during the months.
The last subject in this interview, which is, I think this is the most important of all, like you very well know, I call it, this is like an old moniker from over 20 years ago. I invented this concept of king fear, and that's what I later found out is called sacred horror, and Rudolf Otto's Mysterium Tremendum et Fascinans, the tremendum part. And I think this is a subject which is quite rarely approached and studied in modern occultism, don't you think?
Yeah. I think it's unfortunately maybe too rare. I think because it's such a primary element that is a catalyst for so many other things. So understanding these things, I think the problem with modern occultism is there's a tendency to cherry pick traditional things, but then leave the rest by the wayside, or even worse, say that these things didn't know, but these people know better, and that you kind of sever a chain. And I always think it's best to look towards the traditions that were thousands of years old instead of some black metal guys that came up with their own thing. So yeah, I think that these aspects of the tremendum, like you spoke of, the trembling, the awe, it's at once two things. It's awe and it's terror in one. And this is again the hallmark of the opening of a gate into the numinous. Without that, it's probably just ego adornment and really pointless. So I very, very important concepts to me for sure.
I had a good discussion about this just yesterday with Richard Gavin. I recorded his interview, and I like to get the rare people. This subject is so rare that I like to get everybody opinions who are involved with this kind of thing, because that's like really a gem for me. Could you tell what is your, if you will, what is your most starkest experience with this sacred horror?
Oh man, that would be hard to nail down, truthfully. If I had to pick one shining moment, I mean, I've had several through dreams and then some not in dreams. Oh man, I did a initiatory experience with actually a Golden Dawn years and years ago. I spoke about this on the previous podcast, so I don't want to rehash too much. But that one led to a significant night, and that and kind of, I guess you could say, resulted in what could be categorized as maybe paranormal occurrence. And so that was significant. That one really made me think for a while. Just when you have anything uncanny like that actually break into like your regular mode of existence, you're gonna pause for a second and really consider certain things. But I've had it I've had it multiple times in different measures, even during ritual or meditation. So yeah, I don't know if I could nail it down one time. There's certain dreams that even pop forward, like lucid dreams and stuff, that's kind of culminated in a very very much a state of abjection to that. It got to a breaking point to where I, woke up startled and even vocalizing screams or whatnot. So yeah, I definitely know the experience, and I know it very well. I even as a child, I had some pretty uncanny experiences with that. One that was, this is before I had any context of the esoteric or understanding what was going on. So you're more a passive voyager at that point. But even one that it got so dramatic, family and stuff, that I ended up in the hospital and stuff like that. But yeah, usually most of them are related to parasomnias, but not all. I feel like if I'm doing ritual correctly, with it just seems to be my spiritual disposition and my mode, like that is the ecstatic gate that I'm trying to travel through. That if I'm doing it correctly, that a measure that will occur, and sometimes that measure is more abundant than others, and it could also get to the point that it just, it reaches a terminus, and I, am overcome by it, but it's still kind of a success in a way, I guess you could say. But yeah, I don't know if I could point to one particular shining moment.
I understand, and I think that gives another good examples for our listeners what is this subject about. And it's interesting that I have probably talked about this issue with all of my guests thus far, and it seems like I'm trying to pick up persons or artists or writers that are who know about this kind of thing. It's basically, it might be the sole purpose of the Mycelium signal. I'm so obsessed about that, and we are at the collective about sacred horror. And I think to just add another thing at the end, like Richard Gavin said, it's a humbling experience. It's a cathartic, and it's like some kind of like a testing stone. Can you pass this? Yeah, that's why it's so important.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a trial. It isn't something that you can continue to approach passively. Yeah, people might experience this passively or accidentally, or just it happens. But again, if you want to cultivate it, you have to be able to step forward into that, darkest of nights and tread through that unseen path and push yourself forward and forward and forward. And it is humbling. You'll learn a lot about yourself in the process, and you'll learn about your own weaknesses and things that you need to refine. And you do it over time, and you have to increase will and really root yourself and not fall subject to complacency. You might have a very phenomenal experience, and you don't want to again chalk that up to some kind of ultimate success and then become complacent. You got to just kind of almost dismiss it, learn from it, dismiss it, move on. It's kind of a state of perpetual becoming towards a whatever your end goal is. And so it's very important, and the more you do it, the more you push into it, the more terrifying it'll become. So it's like you're constantly between the hammer and the anvil, basically. It is very Nightbringer. It's very dark night of the soul, and I don't think that there's ever an eventual release into some kind of comfortable, majestic repose of any sort. So
it comes to my mind that if one, just to add more fuel to the fire, so to speak, everybody knows, at least in some kind of like a folkloristic sense, about psychedelic bad trips, for example, or some kind of near-death experiences. I mean, that kind of near experiences where you just avoid dying, perhaps choking, and you are rejuvenated or whatever. That this kind of thing, like a very stark experiences. And I had like a recent very, very nasty experience with this kind of thing around 3 weeks ago. I happened to got like a very nasty weird infection, and I got this like mild fever. And the day I got the antibiotics, and I didn't read the side effects, and I should have, and nobody warned me about that. The fever was rising, and I almost got to the 40. You might have like a different measurement in the States,
Yeah.
but that's considered like a high fever anyway.
High fever.
And
Yeah.
I had a high fever, and I went to the bed, and I tried to get some sleep, and then something very, very strange happened. I got into this kind of like a death agony or something. It was like the normal feverish hallucinations and whatnot, but it was like full of paranoia and full of pain. It was even worse than getting the fucking COVID back in the day. And that was the worst disease I ever got before. And this was even worse because it was like I felt I was in hell, and I completely lost, in an ecstatic sense, my own like a sense of myself. And I was like completely almost helpless in the sense that I couldn't think that this will go away or anything. I was just mumbling and raving, and I tried to stand up from the fever, and I was so hazed that I couldn't do that, and I was trembling, and it went on and on. I started to get these visions where somebody was fucking drilling in my spine with a like drill or something, and the pain was just absurd, and the psychic pain too. And then it went away, and after some days or something, because I got lots of weird side effects too. But I read the long list, and of course there were like many mentions of possible side effects which would lead to actually dying. And then there was this medicine, this antibiotic could cause some kind of psychotic breaks, so it really messes something in your brain. And I happen to got this probably quite rare side effect, and I'm never going to fucking take that antibiotic ever again. But I only read it afterwards. But when it happened, it felt like religious experience of like getting a taste of hell, you know.
Yeah, and sometimes these experiences aren't nice, right? But
Yeah.
you know, you learn something from them, and you come out of them changed. You know,
Yeah.
the descent to hell. You know, yeah, and those things. I mean, when I was younger, I definitely did drugs, and I did acid and mushrooms, and you know, all that shit. And I don't know why I kept doing it, because I always had a terrible fucking time. I think I did it because I was still fascinated by the end. Like, I was always the guy that had the bad trip, right? You know, because that's just my mind. My mind just I have an innate capacity to go to dark places, right? So typically once you put the magnifiers on that brain, it's not going to go anywhere nice. But I don't regret them. I don't regret them. I had some really amazing experiences, and you know, when you're under the influence of a very hardcore hallucinatory substance, like, you will have some experiences, and I don't think that it's not valid. It's just another mode of thinking. Um, and yeah, so like, I don't regret any of them, even the most horrific, which I had very many horrific experiences on hallucinogens, but also moments of just like absolute, I don't know, just elation in the middle of that horror, or realizations or revelations. And you know, so those are interesting. It's not something that I really is my thing anymore these days, but I definitely don't I don't judge anybody for going down that path if it's done with that intent. So yeah.
Any kind of real ecstatic practices or something which really like pushes your normative sense out of your body are really like a teaching moments, because it's like you get this, you are grateful that you are alive after that kind of experiences, and they really like shake your foundations. And I think that's important initiatory practice. I mean, like, whatever way you are inducing this kind of thing, there are many ways.
Yeah, and that's a hell of a way to induce it, especially if you've ever had an experience where you've done, LSD or whatever it is, and it ends up being incredibly potent, and you're just like immediately just thrown out of your fucking self. Not a very comfortable feeling at all, and then you realize you got 8 hours to try and manage this, and you will go to hell and back basically. But again, you can draw some gnosis from that. I found it interesting that there's these institutions now that are using stuff like psilocybin for people that are terminally ill, right? So
Yes.
they're terminally ill, and they live in a constant state of anxiety because they know they're going to die soon, which is very understandable. You would imagine you'd go into this very existential state quickly where you'd be questioning everything, and that could maybe not be the greatest place to reside. And so these treatments, I watched this whole documentary on it, and they said they gave him heroic doses of of psilocybin, and I was like, heroic doses does not sound fun. And it is basically to terrify them, and they have a psychologist or psychiatrist that sits with them as they go through this, right? And some of these people are like elderly people, or they're like regular people that have never done this, never even considered such a thing, and they go through this Dante-esque experience with someone guiding them and talking to them, and they kind of go to hell because they've been given such a large dose of hallucinogens, but then they have such a cathartic experience at the culmination of this terror, and then they realize like that the death that is impending is meaningless. And so I just thought that was really interesting, because then a lot of them come out of it and they've lost their fear of death, and it's like, so they're basically thrown into the middle of the ocean, so to speak. Yeah. And I'm like, yeah, that'd be terrifying, but you're already facing something that is ultimately more terrifying than anyone can conceive, knowing that you're going to die. Like, I mean, we're all going to die. We all know we're going to die, but we don't know when. These people know that pretty soon they're going to die, pretty soon, and their bodies are failing. So terrible thing. And then they put them into this state that shocks them into this abjection and this mode that they have to go through hell, and then they come out with this revelation, and I found it incredibly interesting.
Yeah, it really is. I have learned about this subject for many years now, and I think there was this article about this Finnish guy who had a terminal cancer, I believe, and he was completely like paralyzed with fear, and he did some like a solitary like a catabasis with psilocybin mushrooms, and he really explained it like you just did, and he got this overwhelming sense of fear. And I believe he confronted the king fear himself, and then he got over it. And he said that he probably has a couple of months to live, but he doesn't have the fear anymore. Like with the case with these people who have had these near-death experiences, it kind of somehow alleviates the fear of death. And that I find it endlessly fascinating too.
Yeah, and the same author I talked about, David Hufford, did a lot of work on near-death experiences as well, besides the night terror stuff, and really interesting findings. But yeah, it's the same thing. These people that had literally clinically died on the operating table, and then a lot of them go into an out-of-body experience where they're viewing themselves from afar, and even during periods where the doctors were like, "There's no possible way this person could have been conscious during this." They're describing all the people that were in the room, all these things that there's no way they could possibly know. So that's kind of interesting. And then afterwards they lose their fear of death. And so, I very much believe that, death is a process. I don't think it's going to be in a modern Christian context where you're just, hanging out with family and friends by any means. But whatever it is ineffable. We couldn't possibly understand it now, but I don't think it's just the black oblivion.
I agree. That's an interesting topic. If we are going to have a follow-up episode someday, we can delve into that. But I think this is a good point to conclude this interview in death. That is the end of all and the end of this podcast. And thank you, Kyle, for joining us today and providing such profound insights. And this has been really like a privilege to get you on this Mycelium Signal podcast right after Richard Gavin. So.
Perfect. Yeah, Richard is a genius, man. Nothing but respect for the guy.
This has been Rihmastosignaali podcast. Stay tuned for a special rendition of Bestia Arcana's apocalyptic Hellmouth's lyrics recited by Dr. Martin Locker. Good night.
Consummatum est. The weight of long years is upon us now, the entirety of ages but a falling. Dreadful compression, inevitable pull of the abyss, a singularity of pain and anguish. The age of wrath is upon us. Who will withstand the fires of the judgment? Who will withstand the fires of the pain? What hope for desiccate husks, a sea of mouldering bones and ashes, as dry dust are we become, yet as tinder awaits the flame. Gnashing teeth of hell, grinding all to residuum, the tower is broken, we fall headlong into desolate depths. Then arose the great dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and the garden was made desolate. This is Leviathan, the crooked serpent.